Here we go. Thank you for the dance, Timothy. And again, good morning to you.
How are you doing, Maya? How is everybody this morning?
Everybody's fine, thankfully. I hope that everything is fine with you too. You certainly look good. And thank you for choosing the scenery behind you. It's beautiful.
It's a nice day. No clouds in the sky. I can still see the moon. It's a beautiful sailing day. And after this briefing, that's precisely what I intend to do.
Beautiful. So let's start. So there is no need for you to stay here too long, just long enough for the briefing and the questions and answers after that. So thank you very much for being here once again to everybody on Clubhouse. And here we have Timothy Langley with us, CEO of Langley Esquire, a consultancy in Tokyo. So he's going to brief us again on the latest happenings of Japanese politics.
What's going on?
Yes. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maya. Good morning, everybody on Clubhouse and to those listening in on LinkedIn. Japanese politics is always in flux. There's always something going on. And we're here to talk about it every week, giving you an update on what's going on. So I really appreciate you tuning in. And if you have questions or issues you'd like to discuss, either write to Maya, or you can drop some questions into the link, or you can come up onto the show platform once we finish the briefing and go into just the Clubhouse Q&A. But for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about what's going on in Japanese politics that is important to you, that you need to have a handle on so that you can get through the week and understand what's going on, what's happening in the news, what it means, and how you might be able to better position or advise, your employer, your clients, your customers, that sort of thing. So let's get right to it. Top on the list every time we talk about Japanese politics is the prime minister, because of the hierarchical structure of Japanese politics and the way that the LDP has dominated Japanese politics in the entire post-war period. And the prime minister is at the head of that. He's the head of the cabinet. And so we typically, many things start from the head and they filter down. So Mr. Kishida has been in office now for 1 year, just maybe a year and a week or so. And the credit cards, or not the credit cards, the scorecards on how he's doing, how his administration is doing, is really not looking very good. They had another poll. So these polls come out on a monthly basis. Kyodo News published a poll based on a rather significant telephone survey. And they published that on Thursday. The prime minister's approval rating has plummeted. It is now at the 30% point. That means it's hovering around 32 to 28%, depending on who you talk to and what the questions are. But the disapproval rating has also spiked. So currently, the Japanese Diet is in session. It started 2 weeks ago. It opened with the prime minister starting on Monday with a policy speech, very detailed, elaborate. And then for the next 4 days of that session, the opposition party was allowed to question him and ask questions of him and his cabinet. And what do you mean by this? And what are you doing? And what's your response to COVID? And when are the tourists going to be coming in? And how much money are you going to be devoting to this idea of enhancing human resources? You've talked about that. So what specifically does that mean? So the Constitutional Democratic Party started off on Tuesday, and then it went kind of in a pecking order: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. On Friday, on Thursday, I believe he appointed his son, his eldest son, 31 years old, who had been working in his office staff, to be his executive secretary. And this caused a big brouhaha and a lot of criticism because he was just on the hot seat Not just him, but his administration too. Members of his cabinet were on the hot seat as well to describe and to explain different positions. And for this to come up at that time, it was still fresh in the minds of everyone about the Abe funeral, how much that cost, why we did that. Even people didn't want that to be done, and you did it anyway. And the Unification Church that just continues to morph and to grow. A lot of criticism, and then his son coming up as his number one secretary. There's a lot we can discuss on that. Maybe push it off to the Q&A. Nepotism is a feature of Japanese politics, as it is in many countries. So it's only a shocker in that it's just another one of those stones that the opposition can pick up and hurl at the prime minister. And there are a lot of those laying around, and we're going to talk about those. So besides nepotism, the prime minister's pledge for new capitalism, we've talked about that on this show frequently. It's a frequent topic because we understand that the prime minister wants to distance himself from Abenomics and the three arrows of Abe, and he wants to have something new and fresh. Mr. Suga, when he was in office, right after Mr. Abe's term of office, he really didn't touch much on the economic policy of Japan. He left Abenomics pretty much alone. But Mr. Kishida came in. He wanted something fresh. He wanted to distance himself from Mr. Abe, and he came up with this new form of capitalism, which kind of sounds maybe good, depending on who you are, but it does raise the atmosphere of perhaps socialism. The stock market, the Tokyo stock market, took a plunge after that because of the implications for capital gains tax, that he's going to use taxes on companies in order to force them to be more contributing to the wage increases of their employees. So he actually, in the last 12 months, has backstepped a little bit from that. In his policy speech, when he became prime minister, he was talking about distribution of wealth and raising wages. And in his policy speech 2 weeks ago, when he opened the Diet, he didn't mention the word distribution once. So there is a shift going on there. You have to watch it. You have to be careful about, what is being said and how it's being portrayed to the public. And there's a lot of instances of that. But he's being hammered on that one. You're talking a talk, but you're not walking the walk. So he's getting criticized for that. And it's not just on the new capitalism, but it's on a lot of different things. There is some progress that's being made in certain areas. The digital agency is making some good progress. It's visible. Konotaro is making some real distinct measures, putting them into place. But I think on whole, the Japanese population is finding his leadership wanting. There's a couple of calculations on political leadership in Japan and the approval rating and the appreciation of the public for the cabinet and for the prime minister. And when those two numbers come in at around 30%, then they say, the calculations say that the prime minister is not good for the long haul. And I'm afraid the current prime minister is facing that. He's also got a really persistent issue with inflation. As we talked about in the last session, there are more than 500 products that are going for price increases this month. They've already started, and now people are really beginning to feel it. In October, in September, and August, they began to come in maybe in the low hundreds, but now 500 this month alone. That means that the manufacturers have applied for the Japanese government for permission to raise their prices. They received that permission, and now those are being implemented. So you're going to be seeing that at the cash register, and probably many people here on the show have also noticed that. Gas prices are a little bit different. The prime minister has to fix something quickly, and there's not much that he can do. It's usually guiding, the ship of state. It takes a long time to get your policies together, and particularly with this prime minister, he's talking and not making decisions. So the outgrowth of what his decision making, his leadership has a long fuse on it. So he's got to get the quick ones. So he's talking about supplementing, subsidizing fuel prices, because that's a that's a daily thing, and you can see that very quickly. And also subsidizing energy costs for heating and that sort of thing. So he's got that issue with him. The yen dollar, I think everybody on the briefing understands the yen dollar is it's a huge issue. Japan is basically an importer of goods and services, is paying dollars for importing that. The yen today is at 148. This is astounding. 148, let me see, 148, I wrote it down. It's 148 plus something. The last time the Japanese government intervened was 17 years ago when the yen was at 147.2. 2 weeks ago, the Japanese government intervened for the first time since then, and the yen was at 147.5. Today it is past 148, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. The Minister of Finance, Mr. Suzuki, was in Washington, D.C. all this week talking with the G20 and talking about, the fluctuation of yens, the yen dollar, actually the fluctuation of currencies in general. And there was a lot of controversy there. In fact, the G20 wasn't able to have a unity of mind to even produce a joint communique. This is very strange. It really shows you that the discord that's going on within the G20, a lot of that has to do with the recent trip of President Biden to Saudi Arabia and his appeal to get more oil being pumped by Saudi Arabia. And the reaction of the Saudis was, kind of no thank you. And in fact, we're going to decrease the production, thereby increasing prices because of the supply, the lower supply. And that really infuriated the White House and has caused a real rift, I think, in U.S.-Saudi relations. So there's more in store for that. The COVID response has also been somewhat weak and tepid. It's actually kind of fallen in the back seat of the car as Japan opens its doors to tourism. So you hear a little less and less about COVID these days, and more about opening the doors for tourism and getting more people to come in here to jigger the economy. But I think people understand that COVID is still here. And in fact, there's news that there's a, what's the word that they use for it? They use it for a twindemic. So influenza comes in the winter, that's going to hit, and there's discussions about a twindemic. And so at one side of the mouth, they're talking about the economy and boosting, tourists coming in. And at the other side, the price of goods and services, plus the yen dollar and the just the incredible amount of dissension that's going on politically really does not portend well for the prime minister. There are two other issues that are pretty prominent in the Diet hearings and among the people who have participated in the poll. One of those is the Unification Church. And it just, when this first came up, I thought it was going to be pretty much a flash in the pan. I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal. And it's turned out to really be one of those stabs that could be a mortal wound to the Kishida administration. The amount of involvement of the Unification Church and the amount of their contribution to developing over 40 years the LDP, and in particular the Seiwakai, the formerly known as the Abe faction, is really just tremendous. There were two issues that came up this last week. Once again, one was Mr. Yamagiwa, the Minister of Economic Revitalization, and the continuing inability of him to speak convincingly about what his role was with the Unification Church. And the second one is with the Speaker of the House, Mr. Hosoda, who was the leader of the Abe faction, the Seiwakai, who is now the Speaker of the House, and his involvement. And it looks like that involvement was fairly substantial. And that became a little bit more public last week. The Diet, thankfully for the Prime Minister, since Mr. Suzuki, the Minister of Finance, was in Washington, D.C., Diet hearings were kind of put on hold because we don't have the Minister of finance there. So they didn't meet this week. They weren't scheduled to meet this week, but the developments in North Korea and the missile launches began to excite things. And so the opposition party insisted that at least the Minister of Defense show up and answer questions. So that happened on Thursday and Friday, but it wasn't scheduled. The LDP accommodated that. I'm sorry, the LDP, the Prime Minister and the cabinet accommodated that request to talk about defense issues. But now with the G20 over, people came back into town. I think this next week is going to be a hot one for the Prime Minister, extremely hot. And the final issue that's really bothering the Prime Minister is the funeral of former Prime Minister Abe. So they came up with how much it cost and how much they said it was going to cost. And in fact, they overestimated how much it would cost, and they paid less for that. So I think the numbers, I'll get into the numbers later as I get into that in my topics. But it's kind of, good news for the Prime Minister that they didn't spend as much as they thought they might spend. But that part is over. There was another funeral for the former Prime Minister in Yamaguchi, where his election district is. There are a couple of issues that are going on there that are pretty important. One is the redistricting and the need to reduce several prefectures, 10 prefectures, 10 districts, reduce them in numbers of representatives because the numbers just don't support it. There are too few votes for too many people, and so the Supreme Court has said that's unconstitutional. You need to change it. But there's been some real movement there. The Osaka District Court also held that just the last election in the upper house, which was held just a couple of months ago, failed to have parity with the number of people who were voting and the number of representatives. And they called that election in Osaka, what was the word they used? In a state of unconstitutionality. They didn't say it was unconstitutional, but they said it is in a state, but they didn't go the one step further by nullifying what the results were. They basically said, and there are 6 other lawsuits that are going on now challenging, the disparity. This has been going on for more than 10 years. There is a solution. It has been agreed upon. The Supreme Court has allowed the LDP to manage this, and it is currently called the 10+10. So that means that 10 districts will lose a member and 10 districts will gain a member. In Yamaguchi Prefecture, Mr. Abe was one of the Diet members there that somebody needed to give up a seat. And with his death, it looks like that issue has been resolved. But needless to say, there was another funeral this last, actually just yesterday, for the passing of the former Prime Minister. So maybe this is kind of being put a little bit in the background. But I've got to tell you, this next week is going to be extremely hot and hostile with the Prime Minister. There's a lot going on, and I'd like to get into that a little bit more. With regard to the Abe funeral, it was predicted to be 1.66 billion yen. I don't have the US dollar figure for that. But it turned out to be 1.24. So there was a reduction there. And the initial number of the venue, which was 240 million yen, was the number that the Prime Minister put out first, that this is what it's going to cost. So, don't be excited about it. It's going to be a state funeral. I know it's somewhat rare for Japan to have a state funeral, but it's only going to cost that amount of money. We still good, Maya?
Yes, we are. Sorry.
Okay,
Yes.
I just got a dialogue box. So that was the number for renting the venue, the Budokan. And I think people just picked that up real quickly, that there's a lot more involved in that. So the actual numbers have come out, and yes, it is 240 million for renting the Budokan for that event. But there's a lot more that's involved with it that he didn't quite get into, and that generated a lot of, suspicion and concern. And are you being transparent with this? So that's also eating at the popularity of this prime minister. The security for that was 480 million yen, which is not quite twice what the venue cost is, and almost, clearly twice the amount of what the venue cost was the handling of foreign dignitaries. So dignitaries from about 120 individual states and international organizations came. And typically what happens is the foreign ministry has somebody assigned to those individuals. For example, if it's an ambassador, there's somebody who is closest to the ambassador, maybe the ambassador of Japan in that area. So when that visitor comes to visit Japan, they also have to bring the ambassador too, because they've got to handle them and take care of them and introduce them around and have dinner with them and that sort of thing. So it's not just 120 individuals that are coming. It's also a delegation from the Japanese, from wherever that location is, also coming to Japan. So there's hotel costs, there's cars, there's food and dining. Lots of things are involved in that. So the last kind of big episode or account of money was 10 million for the vehicles for the honor guard for the state funeral. So the prime minister has come out and said publicly he was in country all week. He's had several visitors. He's going to Canada in 2 weeks, a pretty big visit for him. Australia in 2 weeks. And the Australians came in big force for the Abe funeral. So they sent not only the current prime minister, but I think 3 other former prime ministers to the state funeral. So the relationship between Japan and Australia is growing. It is being bolstered. It is being purposefully managed, as it is with a lot of other countries, Canada and India in particular. But the prime minister now has to boost investment in HR resources. And he's talked a lot about that, about how much money he's going to invest in generating HR skills and moving people from one skill level to another skill level. Once again, it's kind of light on details. We really don't know what that means, how in a company the government is going to help a company bring skill levels up, and how you're going to enhance that. But apparently he's earmarking quite a bit of money for the next 5 years to do that. The second thing that he has talked about is growing the startup ecosystem. There's a lot going on there. We've talked about it here. He's investing a lot in that. There's a group of young entrepreneurs who will be going to Silicon Valley to kind of learn through osmosis how that ecosystem works, and then come back, and it's kind of like this trading of academics or exchange students, the same sort of recipe for bringing that technology and that friendship and that kind of flow of information back here. I don't know if it'll work. Japan really needs to boost the startup community, generate more ideas and more companies to be involved in that. So that's what the prime minister's plan is, because he wants to have the economy fulfilling the coffers of taxes, and he needs to have better ideas coming. Japan has been in the doldrums for 30 years. It's been just basically in a depression, and this prime minister really needs to pull the rabbit out of the hat. He is not your economic-minded prime minister. He is more of a foreign relations, skilled foreign minister. But I think in the current environment, that's not what Japan needs. And I think, if something happens with the prime minister, it's not going to be because his poll ratings force him to resign. It will be because within the LDP, they just don't see the need to keep him as prime minister. And gosh, I hate to make predictions like this, but it just over the next couple of months, it looks like it's going to be very tough. So we will keep a look on that. The other thing the prime minister has kind of hung his hat on is, promoting decarbonization and the economic benefits of decarbonization for the economy and also digitization. A big deal. So there's quite a link there in reducing the amount of carbon footprint by digitizing and by digital innovation. So there's a lot going on in that. And the final thing that he needs to do is increase wages. He's talked about that. Wages have come up a little bit, but because of inflation, people are not satisfied with that. They're not seeing the benefits of it. Spending has already gone down this month. It looks like this will continue for a couple of months. The prime minister needs to jigger the economy somehow. One way he's doing that is opening the doors for tourism. So tourism is a component of the economy. It's a kind of a trigger mechanism for the economy when you have foreign tourists coming in, and also the Japanese, internal tourism, which far exceeds the foreign tourism. But it's a kind of a signature for growth and innovation and excitement in the economy. So he's really pushing that, and he's hoping it's going to generate a huge windfall for the economy as a kind of act event. So he's done a couple of things there. But right now, currently this month, the prime minister needs some short-term benefits. He needs to kind of make people like him a little bit more. So there are two ways that he can do this. One is just by giving money away, which he is doing. He's already, it's actually in the discussions now that depressed and low-income families will receive a certain amount of money, maybe gomayan, 50,000 yen. Is that right? Yeah, 50,000 yen. No, 50,000. Yeah.
Yes, it is 50,000. Yes.
Thank you. I get confused with the numbers. Gomayan, so that they can take care of essential needs. That's a gift. It's kind of a one-time gift. It does make people appreciate him, at least in the lower echelons who are receiving that. And probably Komeito appreciates that and is pushing for it. But he's got to do something more than that. So he is subsidizing for a longer period of time the gas prices. And probably you're going to see something coming out in the next 2 weeks where there's going to be a subsidy program for food and that sort of thing. Already they've started opening the border. So 100 and let me say it's not 100, it's 65 countries now have visa-less programs to come into Japan. You don't need to have your mask on. You don't need to go through a tourist agency to do this. You can do this on your own. And the prime minister has said that this is going to generate a boost to the economy. The only problem with that is that the Chinese are not participating in this new opening. The Chinese probably account for 47% before COVID of all of the foreigners that were coming in. And since they have a COVID zero policy, none of the Chinese will be coming in now. So the doors opened up on the 11th, which was Tuesday of last week. And you might have noticed it. I think it's kind of unmistakable. The number of foreigners that have been out on the streets and in the shops and in the tourist destinations, it's starting, but it's not as robust as they hoped for. And I think the target of generating a huge windfall is not quite in the cards yet. And I think without the Chinese being there, it's also difficult to foresee. The good part about the foreigners coming in is that to them, Japan seems to be a lot cheaper because of the yen-dollar ratio. So with the yen at 148 today, who knows what's going to happen? There are some predictions that it could go to 155. There has been no word, even in Washington, D.C., through the mouth of Finance Minister Suzuki or from Mr. Kuroda, the president of the Bank of Japan, that there is going to be any intervention. So this is it's kind of a scary time because you don't know what's going to be happening with the economy if the yen continues to fall. So I expect there to be some movement there. I think there's going to be more frustration described first before that intervention comes in. But it's a big deal when the Japanese government intervenes in the economy like that. And history has shown that even when they do, it really produces very little, good benefit, long-term benefit. Anyway, enough about Mr. Kishida, although he's kind of involved in all of the topics that we're talking about today. But I would like to shift to Seiwakai, which is the largest political faction within the LDP. 98 members. The next biggest is Mr. Motegi's, then Mr. Aso's, and then Mr. Kishida's factions. But they are not quite, but about half of what the Abe faction is in numbers. So the Abe faction has the ability to sway and influence Japanese policy at all levels. And there are 5 ministers in the cabinet from the Abe faction. So even Mr. Kishida, when he wants to do things, he needs to be bold. He needs to express leadership. He really has a difficult time doing that because so much of his base is spread out among the factions, in particular the Abe faction. So what is going on in the Abe faction is really important, and that's why we're going to talk about it. So it's since the death of Mr. Abe, who took over from Mr. Hosoda, this faction, it has been ruled by a committee of about 5 or 6 people. There are about 7 or 8 that are involved in it. The chief cabinet secretary is also of the Abe faction. He's in there because he's so prominent. He's not one of the identified members, but he is one of the leaders. Also, Mr. Nishimura, the Meti minister, is also from the Abe faction. He's not within the leadership group, but he wields a lot of influence. But there are essentially 5 people, 6 people who are kind of guiding that. And what they had hoped for and what they promoted between the death of Mr. Abe and the state funeral is we're not going to do anything until the end of the state funeral. And then we're going to make some decisions on how the leadership should be. In the meantime, there's been a group, Japanese people love to form groups. Political people love to form groups, and you can belong to several different groups. There is one group. It's the members of the LDP who have only won 3 diet sessions. I'm sorry, three elections. So usually in running for Japanese political parties, in the lower house at least, in your first year, you're an ichinensei. You really you're learning how to do things. You do favors for people in the party. You try and find your way. You try and find a place where you can develop a specialization. In your second term, you've won 1 election. This is your second term. You have a little bit more throw weight, and the LDP relies on you a little bit because you can hold your seat, and they can depend on you a little bit more. Your third term, it becomes a little bit more solid, and by your third term, now you've got 2 elections that you've surpassed that have their own ichinensei. So there are younger guys who look up to you and who rely on you for your advice and counsel, and who are doing favors to groom a relationship with you. 4 and 5 really, you're really starting to make good progress. And typically, once you have your 5th election under your belt, people say that you deserve a cabinet post. So the people who are 5 and more within the Seiwakai far outweigh the number of younger people in there. And there are so many in this group that still haven't received a ministerial portfolio. So the younger ones are saying, there's confusion going on, but these older guys, they're just struggling because they want to be in the cabinet. And here I am, I'm going to lose my way. And who knows what's going on internally with the faction in the first place. So there's a lot of dissension going there. The leaders are Shimomura Hakubun, who was Minister of Education, very prominent with Mr. Abe. Shionuga Nuya Ryu, um, Koichi Hagiura, Tsuyoshi Takagi, Nobuo Kishi, the younger brother of the slain prime minister, and Mr. Seko. So this group has been identified within the LDP as the leaders, and they're struggling among themselves who is going to be the leader. They had somewhat identified one of the individuals. They couldn't make a consensus, so there's still great flux that's going on there. Um, the Seiwakai, as a 98 member unified force, is very powerful, but none of these people that I've mentioned to you, even the chief cabinet secretary, has the weight and the personality and the length of a relationship with all of these members as Mr. Abe had. And Mr. Abe played his cards pretty close to his chest. He didn't have quite a number two. So um, this doesn't portend well for the longevity of the Seiwakai, keeping that gel together. We're going to continue to watch that and keep reporting on it to you, because we expect some breaking news there within the next couple of weeks. COVID, you're not hearing a whole lot about these days, except within the context of a twindemic. This is a new term that they've come up with that signifies the influenza outbreak, which always hits in the winter, and the COVID outbreak. So without alarming people too much, I think it's taken a little bit of a backseat, but there is plans in place to deal with that. And this is what the government has said about this twindemic. They anticipate, first of all, the budget is going to accommodate bolstering hospitals and support staff, and they've dedicated money to that, and also enhancing the intake capabilities. But they're preparing for simultaneous outbreaks of both COVID-19 and the seasonal influenza. And the numbers, they say, are they are anticipating 750,000 infected per day during the peak of the season. And they understand that they just can't handle that. 450,000 of these will be COVID, they predict, and 300,000 will be influenza. So what they've put into place now, and unless you're careful and you're watching it, you're going to miss it. But what they're putting into place now is a kind of a stopgap, so that for people who are above elementary school to 64 years old, you have a certain process, a different process to follow. If you feel like you've got influenza, or if you feel like you've got COVID, to call, to use the internet, to communicate with the district, and maybe get a test sent to you. And so they're trying to do this offline, or without you going into the hospital or the clinic. And for those people who feel more seriously attacked by influenza or COVID, then they have a different process. So they are gearing up for that. It's somewhat alarming to hear that, but it's pushed in the background, because I think the Kishida administration has acknowledged that it's got to be the economy. We've done this enough. We've done it for almost 3 years. We've got to put this to bed, and the economy has to take more front and center, reading more about this. But the COVID and influenza, this twindemic, that's going to be an issue that will come up as we move into November. G20 ended on Thursday, giving people time to go back to their countries. The finance minister, Mr. Suzuki, whose father was also finance minister and prime minister, is back in town. The diet, as I said earlier, took a little bit of a hiatus this last week. Normally, the diet opens up and they go 160 days. 69 days for this extraordinary session. And they had to take it off because of his involvement in the G20. When he comes back, he's going to be peppered with questions. And in the meantime, the yen has gone to 148. It will probably go higher. It's gone from, oh my gosh, from when Prime Minister Kishida started to now, it was at 110, and now it's at 148. that is astounding, and people could rightly say, that's your fault. Of course, he'll say there are a lot of other issues that have gone into that, but it is over his term. And similarly, the number of deaths of COVID have the largest proportion of those deaths have occurred under the Kishida administration in the last year. So there's something to be said about that. There was no joint communique issued over G20. We talked a little bit about that. Part of that is, it's a complicated issue. So Saudi Arabia is a major oil producer and a major figure in OPEC. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to the president, was in Saudi Arabia in April, and it didn't quite roll very nicely. The Crown Prince, MBS, as he's known, his name is Mohammed bin Salman, became prime minister since this exchange with Jake Sullivan. But he is the crown prince. He is going to become the king. Everybody knows that. And he got into a shouting match with Jake Sullivan in April, and it was not very pleasant. Jake Sullivan was in a conversational tone mentioning about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who is a reporter who was killed, and the investigations have revealed that hit was ordered by Mohammed bin Salman. And the Crown Prince did not want to hear that. He didn't want to hear that from the United States or from Jake Sullivan. And I think things got worse from there. The president went to Saudi Arabia last week to ask for the Saudis to produce more oil, especially in light of the elections that are coming up, and was kind of given the one finger salute that, no, in fact, I think we're not going to do that, and we're going to reduce production. So there's a real rift going on between Saudi Arabia and the United States right now. It has injected confusion into the G20, and it has also injected confusion within the Biden administration, who has an election coming up in 3 weeks now. And having Saudi Arabia say that they're not going to enhance production means that the gas prices in the United States are going to go higher, and people will always blame the administration for that rise in cost. So there's a real battle going on in the United States. The lines are being drawn, not just Saudi Arabia and the United States, but I mean geopolitically too. The foreign minister of Canada visited Japan this last week. She spent time with the foreign minister here, and they talked about information and intelligence sharing. That's a pretty big deal. Japan has similar agreements with 7 other countries for defense and analytics. He met with Melanie Jolly on Tuesday, I believe, and she was here for maybe 3 or 4 days, an extended period of time, left Tokyo and then South Korea. And I think from South Korea, she might be traveling back to Canada today or tonight. But this kind of detente among the countries that are familiar with or in the coalition with the United States and the Quad and these kind of countries, these lines of demarcation are really becoming more and more refined and close. So Japan signed a deal on sharing radar technology with India this week too. It could be perceived as dual use. The Japanese constitution prevents Japan from selling, dual use or offensive type weaponry, or even having it. But the Japanese Defense Ministry is being really promoted by the Prime Minister. I think we're going to talk a little bit more in the Q&A about defense, Maya. But the defense spending is going from 1% of the GDP to 2% of the GDP. That has already started. That budget process has already started. And I think in order to enhance that, the Prime Minister is pushing the defense industry to becoming a little bit more mature for selling products overseas, and for the reason why they need to increase the GDP proportion to defense is because of what's going on in the South China Seas. the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the hallmark of Mr. Abe's legacy, and it is being promoted and pushed by Japan now. But it requires more resources, and a lot of those resources the Japanese don't have. The Japanese need to purchase those, and now the kicker is that they're paying for them in Japanese yen, which are, at a devalued value. So it's kind of killing, the budget in two separate ways. Let me see what else we've got here. North Korea. North Korea, we had this briefing last week. They fired 2 missiles before we went on the air. I wasn't aware of that as we went, as the briefing started, but they fired 2 last week on Sunday, and then they fired another one just yesterday. I'm sorry, on Friday. They fired another one yesterday. It was a ballistic missile. The 2 that was fired last week, the analysis is finished. Those were 2 cruise missiles. The one that they fired on Friday was a ballistic missile, and it was accompanied by, strangely enough, 170 mortar artillery rounds that were being shot kind of towards the east and towards the west. It didn't cross into anybody's economic zone, but it was a show of force of, preparing. And in fact, the North Koreans did say this is a practice run for a nuclear strike or for defense of a nuclear strike. But it's very provocative. The 2 that were fired last year, the 2 missiles last year, were cruise missiles, and one of them flew in an oval pattern, and the other one flew in a figure 8 pattern. And the combined travel that both of them made was well over 20,000 kilometers. And that is well enough within the range. Guam is in the range. Okinawa is in the range. All of Japan is in that range. And I think this was a show that we can strike any of these targets, Okinawa, Guam, any place in Japan if we want to. And the ballistic missile was an interesting one because it was at a lower trajectory, but it had a different payload capability. And so Mr. Hayashi, the defense minister, was quizzed. Remember, I said that the Diet was pretty much out of session this last week. The Constitutional Democratic Party insisted, in light of those 2 cruise missiles that were fired, that the defense minister come in for questioning by the opposition party. So they did open the Diet again on Thursday and a bit on Friday, somewhat unusual, to accommodate the demands of the opposition party. And in the briefings that the defense minister had, Mr. Hayashi, he did acknowledge that it looks like North Korea is preparing for a 7th nuclear test. They haven't had a nuclear test since 2017. This would be their 7th. And it looks like preparations are underway for that. That is going to cause a huge international reaction. And it could be the trigger for something more aggressive. So the tensions are being brought up by the North Koreans. The tensions are not being brought up so much recently by China, but there's stuff going on in Ukraine that has been escalated. And they're also, Russia has its own problems too. In Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, there's a group of former Soviet nations that are there that were going through their own war exercises, and it looks like some political problems showed up there, a rift between them and Russia. There's a lot of problems there too. So, it's not just Mr. Kishida that has his problems. It's not just Mr. Biden that has his problems. It's not just Z. Z has his problems too. There was a huge protest just this last week that was put down pretty harshly, but people are sick of being, COVID zero. And he's got some issues there. He's got also some issues with their real estate issues, their problems there too. So North Korea looks like it will detonate a nuclear device within the next. Anyway, I predict it's going to be pretty soon, within the next couple of weeks. The kind of target date for them is between November 7th and now. And November 7th, there's a big celebration going on in the Communist Party of China. So that might be his trigger, and he calculates that for maximum impact. So between now and November 7th is the the most likely time. We talked a little bit about Kono Taro, the minister of the digital agency, and he's starting to make some inroads there. The latest news that he's generating out of that is, you remember My Card, the My Number system is a card that it's kind of like the social security system in the United States, where every individual in the country has their own self-identification, and it is represented in a number, and they issue a card for that. Less than half the Japanese people have taken advantage of that. It is a real goal of Mr. Motegi and also Kono Taro, apparently, to have this more distributed. So they're offering Nimaen, 20,000 yen, for people to register and to sign up for My Card. And if you do that before December, you get a boost on that. I already have mine. I don't think I'm going to get Nimaen for doing that. But it is a huge rollout. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to merge their healthcare, their health card system into the My Number system. So if you're an employee in a Japanese company, you get a card because you've paid into that, and your company is also paid in. It's a copay. And that's why they have nationalized medicine here. So you get a card when you go to the doctors or the hospital. You have your card, but you have to show your card. And then you get a huge discount for your medical services. In fact, it's required that you have that card. So they're going to merge that into the My Number system. And there's already plans afoot that they're going to merge the driver's license also into My Card. So My Card is going to become a bigger and bigger deal. It's put Kono Taro more in the limelight. He loves that sort of thing because obviously he's watching what's going on with the prime minister and with the yen as well. And he wants to be prime minister at some point in time. And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. I think I'm going a little bit long here, Maya, with apologies. Ukraine has sent a list of lawmakers from Ukraine to Japan. They're going to be here for an extended period of time. I think they arrived on Friday. It's a rather big delegation who will be here for a couple of weeks. So the relationship between Ukraine and Japan is beginning to grow. And you might remember that President Zelensky was talking about, Japan, you should stand up to the Russians too, because didn't they take your northern territories, and Russia, you should return those. So there's a little bit of rabble-rousing that's going on there. And at the same time, this kind of friendship building that's going on between the two countries. And of course, that's endorsed by the United States. And so there's a lot going on there. Japan has been, very active in acknowledging the sanctions that the United States pushed. It's been very clear in its opposition to Russia. We talked a little bit about Renault and Nissan last week, not in much detail, but it looks like Nissan is going to close its manufacturing in all of Russia. It has signed a deal to sell the assets of Nissan, manufacturing, research and development, all of that stuff, to a Russian company for €1. So that's a huge loss for Nissan. That's production that's going on there. They're selling their, as their strategy has been globally, is build in those markets to avoid, these the controversy about trade warfare. Build the cars, make the manufacturing, hire the people there, and become part of the economy, and then you get you get better benefits for that. So they tried that with the Russians, and it looks like because of the sanctions, they've decided that they're just going to pull out. So that's another recurring issue. There's a couple of other things I want to talk about, but I think I'm kind of running out of time, Maya. I apologize. Maybe in Q&A we can talk a little bit about Okinawa. There is some movement going on in Okinawa that's of interest. Tourism, we talked a little bit about that. And defense with the spending and what's going on with Saudi Arabia and the United States, which will have impacts here too. Maya, that's about it. I think I've exhausted my time, and I apologize for speaking maybe a little bit too long on what's going on with the Prime Minister. But we can roll into the Q&A and get into better details. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Japanese politics.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your being here and doing the briefing. So let's move to Clubhouse. It has been another very good briefing. There are a few questions there as well. Yes, and the beautiful view. Thank you for choosing it. So I'll see
Thank you.
you there, right?
Okay, thank you. I'll talk to you
Thank
soon.
you.
Thanks,
Yes.
everybody.